Can you think God into existence? Let's consider. Hello, philosophers. I'm Chico. Welcome to the Philosopher Show, where we consider the greatest questions of human history. Here is a sentence that has frustrated philosophers and probably normal people as well for a long, long time, which is, I can prove that God exists without getting out of my chair. No telescopes, no microscopes, no fossils, no miracles, just the meaning of the word. Think how outrageous that is. The claim isn't that the universe points to God. The claim is that if you really understood what the word God means, then you're already committed to his existence. And to deny that is to contradict yourself. That is the ontological argument. And the most interesting thing about this is that even though so many people reject it, it's really hard to say what's wrong with it. But let's get into it. So the first philosopher that came up with this argument is named Anselm. But we'll also look at René Descartes and Alvin Plantinga. On the objection side, we'll look at a philosopher named Gaunilo and how he engaged with Anselm. And then the big one is Immanuel Kant on this one. And we'll even throw a little Frege in there. But our first philosopher is St. Anselm of Canterbury. And he comes up with this bizarre argument in a little book called the Proslogion, in which he's not even trying to debate or anything. He's actually saying a prayer. And then mid-prayer, he just drops this bomb. And it starts with a definition. For Anselm, God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. Now, sit with that for a second, because that's very important. Notice he doesn't say God is the greatest thing. He gives you a description, a ceiling beyond which you can't even think. Whatever else God is, you can't conceive of something greater than it. Now, you may say, I don't believe in God. And he would say, well, you're like the fool in Psalm 14. And the fool says that there is no God. But even to say there is no God, you have to have some conception of what you're saying there is not, right? You have to have a conception of what you're denying. So that concept must exist in your intellect. But a being that only exists in your intellect, in your mind, is less than a being that actually exists in reality as well. So if that than which nothing greater can be conceived existed only in the mind, then you could conceive of something greater, namely something that exists in reality. But then you've conceived of something greater, then the thing that you were saying that didn't exist in reality must not be God, right? It must not be the thing that which then nothing can be greater can be thought. Man, it's so hard to say that. So Anselm concludes with a reductio. You just be contradicting yourself by saying it doesn't exist. Therefore, it must exist in reality as well. Now, I'm going off of Brian Davies' book, An Introduction to Philosophy of Religion. And he points out in that book that the argument really hinges on two different ways of translating one of the premises. You can either translate this as, it can be thought to exist in reality as well, which is greater, or it can be thought to exist in reality as well, what is greater. Now, translation one makes of existence, makes of being a property. It's a great making feature. A thing is greater for having it. Now remember that meaning, because we're going to see Immanuel Kant blows that up. On translation two, you're not adding a property to being. You're comparing two candidates, a mind-only one versus a mind and reality one. And you're saying that the second one is the greater of the two. So that a mind-only unsurpassable being is actually surpassable, which means that it was never unsurpassable in the first place. And therefore you get your reductio ad absurdum. Now, Anselm had an interlocutor, Gaunilo, who wants to say that using this logic, I could come up with some absurd things. So he says, for example, I could come up with a perfect island, an island which no island greater than can be thought. You know, loaded with treasure, lots of palm trees and coconuts and all kinds of fun things. He says, now, by your reasoning, Anselm, if it only existed in my mind, then a real version would be better. So it must exist in reality. So the perfect island is out there somewhere, the greatest island. But that's absurd. Nobody believes that the perfect island is actually out there. And in the same way, you can't define God into existence. Now, one way you could reply is saying that there is no intrinsic maximum when dealing with a perfect island. There's no maximum number of coconuts that would make it perfect, so that you can always add more coconuts. So it's an incoherent idea to say the perfect island. But God is different. God is not a member of a kind. God is unsurpassable being as such. Of course, there is a possible response, and that is the greatest possible orchid, or a perfect detective who could solve every crime. These would both be ideas of greatest things that do seem to have an intrinsic maximum. It seems like if you tried to add to the perfect orchid, you would just mess it up. So, can we say that there's a perfect orchid out there? Probably not, which is interesting. Let me know what you think about that one. Does that nail down Anselm? Okay, fast forward to the 17th century and René Descartes. He believes he's going to simplify everything. By God, we mean a supremely perfect being, a being with every perfection. And existence is a perfection, and therefore, a supremely perfect being which lacked existence would be a contradiction in terms. It would be like saying a triangle that doesn't have three sides. Now, that definitely sounds like a cleaner argument than Anselm's. Unfortunately, however, it leaves him open to Immanuel Kant's critiques. So the first critique he has is that there is no contradiction here. A contradiction happens when you keep the subject but reject the predicate. For example, you keep the triangle but you reject the three sides. But a contradiction does not happen when you reject both the subject and the predicate. So if you say God is a necessary being and you keep God, but don't keep necessary being, that would be a contradiction. But if you reject both God and the necessary being, that's not a contradiction. And then the big one, which is that being is not a predicate. It's not a concept. It's not something that you can think that adds to any object. He has a famous example of 100 thalers. Well, we can say $100. So is there any difference between $100 in my mind and $100 in my pocket? You might think, well, one of them is material and the other one is not. No, I'm not thinking of an immaterial $100. I'm not thinking of like a ghost $100. I'm thinking of a material $100. You might think one you can touch, the other one you can't. I'm not thinking of a ghost $100 that my hand will go through them. I'm thinking of one that you can touch. So what is the difference between the two? Well, one exists and the other one doesn't. But notice that existence here doesn't add anything to the concepts of a $100 bill. It's just that saying one exists posits it in reality, whereas saying that it's just in my mind does not. And that is devastating to Descartes' argument. Now, you might think that that also buries Anselm, but hold on to that and we'll come back to it. I do want to say in David's book that he goes further on and supports Kant with Frege. And while I'll keep the Kant, I like the idea that existence is not a predicate because I don't think it is. I don't agree with Frege. Frege says that existence isn't a property of objects, it's a property of concepts. It's a statement of number. When you say horses exist, what you really mean by that, he says, is just that the concept horse has at least one instance. In logic, you could say that there is an X such that X is a horse. In other words, existence is what the existential quantifier expresses. It's second order. A remark about whether a concept is filled, like some or many or none. To say that, for example, a bachelor exists is just to say that somebody is a bachelor. So that word existence is not doing any work there. Frege's example that he gives is the proposition Venus has 0 moons. Now this, he says, can't be a property of the moons of Venus because there are none. Instead, it's a property of the concept, the moons of Venus. Existence, then, is just the denial of the number 0. In other words, existence is just instantiation. But here's my problem with that. I think that when you say something like that, what you're saying is, here's a list of all the things, and I have a thing that exists, and it's in those things. But what about that saying, this thing exists so that it can be in that set of things? Instantiation actually tells you nothing about existence. It doesn't tell you anything about what makes that thing to actually be. So here are my objections to existence as a quantifier. First, singular existence, break this. This is perfect for stuff like horses exist, right? The quantifier view just handles that great. What about stuff like Socrates exists? You either need to read that as something like there is an X that is identical to Socrates, which presupposes that the name refers. And that makes Socrates exist just trivially true and Socrates does not exist incoherent. Or you have to dissolve the name into some funky thing like it Socratizes, like Quine said, which just, what is that? Either way, the claim stops being about the individual. And then there's negative existentials, like Pegasus does not exist. That's plainly about Pegasus, denying that this posited thing is even real. But the second order reading, only saves this as the non-instantiation of a description. It's just you're describing something by Pegasus and you're saying, yeah, and there's nothing that fits into that category. And whereas that's convenient for the logic, that really doesn't do any justice to the thought itself. Third, I think it changes the subject. It changes the subject from why is this here at all to how many are here. Counting existence presupposes there are things that exist in order to count. By the way, that is Barry Miller's point, also Peter Geach. And Anthony Kenny actually comes from the other side. There's also a problem with contingency. If existence just means that the domain is not empty, think about the radical contingency of an individual, that an individual exists but might not have existed, didn't have to exist. Well, you can't even state that anymore. So you can't even ask the question, which seems to be an important one, why is there something rather than nothing? That seems to be like one of the top metaphysical questions, and we can't even ask that with this view of existentials. One final objection, and I'm not super into this one. Existence is what the quantifier expresses. That's what the idea is here. But there are free logics which quantify over non-existence. In particular, Meinong says that there are real things that don't exist. Now, I don't believe that, but the fact that you can make the claim and it's not incoherent means that existence and quantification must come apart, right? They must be two different things. So I don't agree with Frege. Instead, I think the reason that existence is not a property is because existence is an act. It's actus essendi. What makes the difference between a possible thing and an actual one is that the actual one is doing something. It is existing. That's an act that you're doing, and you can't get a concept out of that. You can only get that in a judgment. Okay, so where I don't agree with Frege, I still see what Kant is saying. I still see that existence is not a concept, which brings us back to Anselm's argument. Remember, I said that one version of that translation made existence into a predicate, made it into a concept. The other version, however, doesn't treat it as a concept. It just ranks two things, a thing that only exists in the mind versus a thing that exists in the mind and in reality, and it says this one is greater than this one. But it never points to something that this guy has and says, throw that on there as a property that this thing has, and now it's greater than that other thing. Now, I also said that we would talk about Alvin Plantinga. So Plantinga has a modal version of this ontological argument, and it goes like this. There is a possible world W in which a being with maximal greatness exists. We'll call that the possibility premise. 2, a being has maximal greatness in a world only if it has maximal excellence in every possible world. So if maximal greatness is exemplified in any possible world, a maximally excellent being exists in every possible world, including the actual one. And by maximally excellent, he includes stuff like omniscient, omnipotent, and all the omnis and stuff like that. So necessary existence is sort of built into the concept here. However, the whole thing leans on premise 1, the possibility premise. Is maximal greatness possibly exemplified? And here's the parity problem. I can run a mirror image. There is a possible world in which no maximally great being exists. But for maximal greatness to exist in any world, it must exist in every world. Therefore, maximal greatness is exemplified in no world. Now, both possibility premises can't be true, and the argument gives you no way to decide between them. Plantinga actually admits this, and he says, in order to prove that his first premise is true, well, you could use an argument for the existence of God, and that would show that not only is it, if it's actually true that God exists, then of course it's true that he possibly exists. So that would show that that premise is true. Problem is, you'd already have an argument for the existence of God. You wouldn't need to worry about this argument. So he says his argument doesn't really prove that God exists. It proves that theism is rational. And the final philosopher we'll talk about is Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas, we've seen already arguments from him for the existence of God. He actually doesn't buy this argument. He knew Anselm's version of it. He obviously didn't know Plantinga. Plantinga is a very recent philosopher. But Aquinas grants you that God exists is a necessary truth. It is true just by virtue of what God is, right? God is his own existence. So it is a self-evident truth that God exists. But that doesn't mean self-evident to us. He says, in order for it to be self-evident to us, we would have to have access to his essence. We would have to have quantitative access, he would say. And we don't. We are limited creatures. We don't have that access to his essence. So even though it is a self-evident proposition, it's not self-evident to us. So he says the argument fails. But what do you think? Do you think the ontological argument works? If not, where do you think it goes wrong? Let me know in the comments. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe and click the notifications button. And if that's still a thing, I don't know. It's been so long since I've done videos. Like, I don't even know what YouTube really does anymore. But anyway, do whatever you have to do, and I'll see you in the next video. Adios.